Are you ready? Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for putting up with us. Thanks for being here from all over the world. We give you Mr. Kevin Stein. And I have a question, Kevin, before we
Yep.
begin. It's not, but that's not literature, is it?
I'm not sure what literature is. Actually, that's a great way to start off. I mean, what is literature? What
Okay.
do people in the room consider to be literature? If you could give me some ideas, then I'd love to see it, right? Karina, Judy, what is literature for you? Um, and you could keep that conversation rolling while we're going through this little webinar, and I'm really happy to be in the room with you all. 20, 22 people from all over the world. It's very exciting, and I'm happy to be a part of the ITDI summer intensive with amazing teachers, and I'm a little bit humbled. So thank you all. And music is, sure, music is literature, poetry is literature, and prose is literature. This is one of my favorite short stories. A man told me the story of his life. It's by Grace Paley, and I come back to it, read it again. It has a lot of different meanings for me as I get older, and it's a sad. I think it's kind of a sad, melancholy story. It's beautiful. Uh, if you got a minute to just read the first maybe paragraph or two paragraphs. So I used this story in class a few years ago, kind of an intermediate level class. The story itself, the words in the story, I think 98% are within the first 2,000 most used words in English. And there's nothing very difficult about the story itself. I was pretty sure that my students could read the story and understand it, but they couldn't. They couldn't. There was something about the story that they couldn't catch, and it wasn't the words. I had them go through the story and underline every word that they recognized and that they thought they knew the meaning of. So they knew over 98% of the words, and yet they couldn't quite get what was going on in the story. Yeah, I think the story has a lot to say to a lot of, whatever age a student is at. Oh, Hannah, you don't think it's sad? Actually, it's yeah, I'd love to talk about this story, but I'm gonna cruise on because my students couldn't understand it, and I kind of stopped using it for a while, and then I became a homeroom teacher, and homeroom teacher in Japan is kind of a strange creature. It means I got 15 minutes every morning to do something, anything I wanted with my students. They were all first year students, and I liked poetry. So what I started doing was taking Tanka, which is a traditional short Japanese poetry form, and I would just put them on the board. This is a Tanka by Tawara Machi, and she is probably the most famous living Tanka writer in Japan. And the reason why I got interested in Tanka actually is I had a friend when I first came to Japan, and his name was Shokawa-san, and he liked the same kind of books I liked, Raymond Carver and Murakami Haruki. He knew a lot about jazz, and he would play me good jazz songs, and we would drink kind of Japanese style whiskey, and he gave me this book of poetry, and I thought they were fantastic, and I started trying to write this kind of poetry as a way to learn Japanese, and I think it gave me a good kind of insight into how Japanese was structured and how it fit together. And the more I wrote the poems in Japanese, the harder it came to translate them into English, actually. It was fun, and it was kind of a hobby. And then I got a new job working at a private school, and I was busy. And then I became a homeroom teacher and had this 15 minutes of block of time every morning. So I started writing a tanka a day on the board. And the language is kind of simple. Here's another tanka. The language is kind of simple, but there was also the fact that most of these tanka were written during a big kind of spoken word poetry boom in Japan, and a lot of them were written by high school students. So they were really, the kind of content was something my students could relate to. And I think that there was something about the feelings that was captured in these tiny little gems of poetry that they connected with. Um, and then I stopped just writing the poem on the board. I started also putting up some questions with the poems, and I would go into class and I'd have 15 minutes. There'd be this poem up there, and sometimes I wouldn't do anything because the students would look at the questions and actually talk to each other about their answers. Um, and actually, some of them were interested enough that they would pull out their cell phones, and they're allowed to use cell phones in my class if they ask me. And they would, sorry, I kind of drifted off the screen, and they would ask to use their cell phones, and they would look up the poet in Wikipedia. And that's when I thought, oh, okay, there's something good going on here, something maybe important for my students. Um, and I still do this now. I've been doing it now for like 2 years. I still pull out tankas, and I have a different grade homeroom, so I have different students. And if you answer any of these questions that pop up on the right side, I will take your answers and I will share them with the class when I use these tankas next time in my class. And if you would like any copies of these tankas, if you're interested in using them in your class as well, I can happily send you a compilation of these as well in a Word document or a PDF. Let's see. And then I started writing the Tonka on the board. This is kind of a long process. And I underlined words that I thought might be difficult or kind of grammar that I wanted them to notice. I wanted them to notice that ISH at the end of girl, because boyish, girlish. It's a good little piece of grammar, and I thought they could pick that up and then use it in their communication. Um, or I thought pretend is a good word, and I thought this is good vocabulary for them. And but then I thought a little bit more about it, and you know, what was I trying to do with this poetry? Was I trying to teach grammar? Was I trying to boost their vocabulary? Or did I just want them to interact with the poem on their own terms? And this might seem like kind of a philosophical question, but I think it gets at the heart of one of the big problems with using literature in the language classroom is that I don't know if there's enough space in the classroom environment and inside this poem to hardcore teach English grammar and vocabulary and kind of impose what you want the students to be looking at, and also for the students to really enjoy reading and coming to their own understanding of a poem. I still don't have an answer to that question. Well, eventually, I took all my traditional Japanese poetry books and I put them onto our extensive reading bookshelf, and I said, if you find a poem in here and you want me to put it on the board in the morning and I'll translate it or you can translate it, then I'll do that. And at lunchtime, some of the students actually did leaf through the books. And a few days later, one of the students came up and asked me to translate this poem by Kei Amano Kei. And we did it together. I sat down with her, and she did a pretty good job of translating it by herself, and I think she learned that it wasn't that difficult, that she had a decent understanding of the language. And then we put it on the board, and the students talked about it, and it was a great experience. And so that led to other students picking out tankas as well. Yeah, I really think that letting students have access to the untranslated text, to the L1 poetry, is one of the things that makes working with these small poems valuable is that if they do feel lost, they can go and just look at it and understand it. And I think there's a lot of different types of short poetry in the world, and accessing those short poems in the L1 is a great way to enrich the classroom and allow for some comparative linguistic work. Oh, Ayat, you are so right. I mean, when you translate a poem, Karl Kraus, I think the Austrian literary critic said, when you translate a poem, it's like taking off your skin at a border crossing and putting on someone else's skin as you step across. But he probably said it much more succinctly than that. So, yeah, it's true that it's going to be different and perhaps not quite as poetic. And but one thing I noticed is the girls really, the girls the in my class really got into this activity, and that most of the books were by women, and so, but I did have some books by men who were Tonka writers, and this is one of them. And I remember when I did this poem, the students got this one. I think it's the next one. Let's see. Ah, it's not. Don't have it in this slideshow. There was a poem. Are those really my tears? Are those mine falling into the egg tray of the refrigerator? And that was the poem. And a lot of students were kind of like, what is this? This is Homura Hiroshi, and he's kind of strange guy. And they couldn't quite get it, so I said, well, draw a picture. Just draw a picture of it. And it was on the board, are these really mine? My tears, are these really mine? Falling into the eggshell holder of the refrigerator. And they drew a picture, and just stick figure with tears coming out, crying into the eggshells holder, egg holder in a refrigerator. And once they saw the picture, it made perfect sense to the students who had been lost. So one of the great things about these kind of very short poems, I think, is they're very visual. And if a student can't get into it just through the words, if they draw the scene, then they can access the meaning. So someone had said that, thanks. Someone said that songs are literature, and certainly songs are literature, and lyrics are also poetry. And I had been spending so much time kind of going through all these tankas one a day with my students that I had also kind of missed out on the poetry that was inside these tanka. And oh, you weren't supposed to see that. I don't know if it'll work now. Probably it won't. So Let's do... Let's try this. Can you do me a favor? I'm going to say a Tonka to you. I'm going to try and say it naturally, the way I would read a Tanka if I was on a if I was giving a public Tanka reading. And could you, if you've got a pencil, could you just write down how you hear it? So we'll put the line breaks where you hear the line breaks and kind of make the poem look like it sounds on a Tanka show. Yeah, if I was on a Tanka. Ready, guys? Here I go. Or ready, all? Here I go. My cat's tail wrapped around his body, a language that only I and my mother understand. Well, maybe I'll say it again. My cat's tail wrapped around his body, a language that only I and my mother understand. So, yeah, dictation style. Thanks, Chuck. So, I wanted to play with the kind of sound and the rhythm, and I stopped writing them on the board, and I would come in and do dictation with the Tonka and have them write it down. And then I would have questions on the board. And this was the first one I did it with, the first Tonka I used where I did dictation. You say, this tastes great. And so the 6th of July becomes our salad anniversary. And this is a poem by Tawaramachi, and it kicked off the whole spoken word Tanka kind of short poem revolution in Japan. She's responsible for it, and she's responsible for a lot of teenagers writing poetry in Japan. And when I read the poem like this, you say, this tastes great, and so the 6th of July becomes our salad anniversary. They this is just to say it is certainly uh similar. This is just to say I ate the plums that were in the ice box. And oh, Tawadamachi, thanks, Chuck. And I think getting a sense of the rhythm and the line breaks allows the poem to come to life more. And then we discussed it. And just out of curiosity, I think that's right. Is this a happy or a sad poem? Can I take a little survey? I mean, do people think it's happy? Oh, I'm so ambiguous. Ironic. Happy, happy. It's kind of split. Ah. With my high school students, the split always seems to be around 70-30. Most people think it's a happy poem. And maybe teachers like that kind of bittersweet quality of things. Tawadamachi says it's a happy poem. And when she was asked about it in a recent interview, she said, yeah, I went out to dinner and we got a salad, and this guy I was with really liked the salad. And so I was really happy. It's a happy poem, which goes to show you that, there's a lot of room for interpreting a poem. You don't have to just go by what the writer feels the poem is saying. Eccentric and strange, which most of these tanka just aren't, right? So I'm gonna go to, so anyway, sorry. My students had been working with tankas for months at this point, 4 days a week, 3 days a week. And that's when my student came up and gave me this poem in English. This, my cat's tail wrapped around his body, a language that only I and my mother understood. And this is actually how she wrote it out on the paper. And I think I read it differently because I hear it differently in my head. So if yours is a little different, I would have probably put the and with my mother on the first line. Although actually as a way to end the line and keep the reader's eye moving towards the next line. And it works pretty well on that second to last line as well. But my student wrote this, and I was thrilled that she didn't do it because it was an assignment. She just did it because she had been hearing these tankas and she had an idea. And so she wrote it. This is the only tanka she wrote, the only poem she wrote. And that was her idea. She had a poem in her and it came out. And I think that's one of the important things about if you're going to work with a form, just working with a form for a week or a day or a class, they might understand the form and they might even appreciate it. But if you want them to actually produce, like anything, they need a lot of input. And I have other students who still write tanka from that class. And I think it's just the continued repeated exposure was necessary for them to feel comfortable. And then they did it without prompting. I guess after a while, I wanted the students to move beyond reading the poems, and I wanted to see what they could do as far as kind of working with poetry in a creative way. And I took a small step and I just left out the last line. And this is also a Tawadamachi Tanka. Parents say they raise their children, but in the garden the tomatoes grow red. And what do you think that last line is? The tomatoes grow red. Ha 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 ha. The tomatoes grow red, the children leave home. So, but a lot of the students could do it. A lot could do it. I mean, there's no the right way to do it. I mean, all of these are fantastic last lines to the poem. And I stay in bed. That's right. The tomatoes grow red and I stay in bed and they keep getting red. It doesn't matter if I get out of bed or not, right? Just as I please, just as they please. And so leaving out a line was pretty successful and I enjoyed it, but I was getting a little, I was running out of Tonka actually, and the kids had read the books. I mean, I only had about 6 or 7 Tanka books at the time, so I decided I would use some haiku, and this is Allen Ginsberg haiku. Allen, I didn't know the names of the flowers. Now my garden is gone. I'm not going to ask if you think this is a happy or a sad haiku. I think everyone would probably agree. And haiku, spoken word, especially the beat poets and spoken word poets, had a kind of have been using haiku and also tanka, although it's not as well known, for a long time. And instead of leaving out a line, the beauty of haiku is that there's so much space inside each of these tiny little poems that students can fill in those blanks. Uh, Oftentimes, haikus are degrammaticalized. The grammar's been stripped out to keep it as simple as possible. And I told the students, well, here's a haiku, and I want you to add a line before or after each line in the haiku. And this is what a student wrote. And this also was surprisingly smooth for the students to just kind of fill in those blank spaces. And I think if you give students, after you work with poetry for a while, if you give them a haiku and you ask them to write into the poem what they feel isn't explicitly stated, and you give them the space to do that, they can start to realize just how much of the poem comes from inside of them, how much of the text is on the paper, but how much of the text is inside. And every student's version is different. And it doesn't have to just be adding lines. Uh, you can take a haiku and you can say, okay, this is a poem and it's expressing the narrator. The narrator. I also explain the concept of narrator to the students because I don't want them to think that every poem is the voice of the poet, but I don't know if that's necessary, but it's something I like to talk about with my students. So this poem is expressing the narrator's feelings. Change two words in the poem so it expresses your feelings. The moon over the roof, worms in the garden. I rent this house. Or thank you. Miguel, have you been looking at my speaker's notes? Because that's one of the activities, right? I love my house. I love my house. There's two words changed. The moon over the roof, worms in the garden. I love my house. The sun over the roof, us in the garden. I rent this house. Yeah, that's nice, Chuck. Sun over the roof, flowers in the garden. I rent this house. And there are so many haiku out there to use in class. This is the World Children's Haiku Contest. They have it every year. I'm so sorry I did not prepare links. I am unprepared for a webinar, but if you just Google JAL Foundation, World Children's Haiku Contest. And the most amazing thing is that all of the haikus have the original L1. They come from all over the world. So no matter where you teach, you should probably be able to find a very nice English haiku written by a younger learner, and that haiku in whatever language of the country where you might be teaching. Yay! Thank you, Chuck Sandy. And there's the link. And one thing I found that was very interesting is that Tanka and Haiku, my lower level students had less trouble with Tanka and more trouble with Haiku. And I think that just the sheer possibilities of haiku, that there's so many ways to understand the poem, can sometimes lead to confusion or a feeling of wanting a little bit more solidity under your feet. So my personal experience is to work, even with short poems, is to work with slightly longer short poems. And after working with Tanka and Haiku, I found 6-word memoirs from Joe Cummins, who has a blog called Creativities and is a writer. she uses these in her class, and I thought, well, these are excellent. Now, are they literature? 6-word poems. If haiku is literature, then cutting it down to 6 words, I guess it's poetry as well. And then there's the story about Ernest Hemingway writing "For sale baby shoes never worn" on a napkin to win a bet that he could write a novel in 6 words. Probably not a true story, but a good story. And students very much enjoyed reading the 6-word memoirs because, like the Tanka, which were written by younger people and dealt with issues that they were familiar with, the 6-word memoir site has a lot of younger writers who are producing these 6-word memoirs, and they're often writing about things that my students can relate to. Yesterday, only child. Today, older sister. And of course, 6 words means that the grammar is absolutely going to be stripped out. So these make fun grammar exercises as well. Just put in the missing grammar words, the function words. And they also lead to great conversations. Is this happy? Is this sad? Why do you think so? And I remember asking about this 6-word memoir. Is it happy or it's sad? And every student talked about their own family. I had a student who said, of course, this is a happy, really happy story because I'm an only child and I really, really always wanted to have a sister. And so it ended up being these kind of personal revelations because they had the vehicle of someone else's 6-word memoir. They could say things about themselves because they were talking about a poem, but they could talk about themselves much more freely than was normal in my classes and is kind of expected in Japan. There's a lot of norms around privacy and what you talk about with people who aren't really close friends. But this gave my students a way to talk. Thank you, Chuck. You're a hero. Great. And then I had my students write some. This was written by a student who had gone away for study abroad and came back, and this is what he wrote. And I think it's pretty revelatory about how he feels to be back in Japan. Oh, Judy, I'm glad to hear that. I work with the 6-word memoirs with high school students, but it's nice to know that older learners like to use them as well. If anyone has ideas of how to use any of these things in class and wants to share them on the chat, that would be great. And I think that in some ways, the 6-word memoirs, for at least for my students, knowing when they read the fact that these memoirs, these 6-word mini stories, you don't have to worry about grammar. You don't have to think about it. It gave them a lot of freedom to, yeah, that's it, Judy. It gives them the freedom to just write, to get their ideas down. Uh, and one of my students produced this, and the, they ended up having this all in English, a very intense conversation about relationships and expectations of boys and girls in high school and how they don't align. And it was it was amazing. And I think by this point in the process, having used Tonka and Haiku and having added words to Haiku and manipulated poetry, that they knew that whatever they wrote, they were only responsible for so much of that poem. And they could write things down and they could give it to other students. Other students could read it, and their anxiety about how it was going to be understood was greatly lessened because they knew that the responsibility for bringing meaning to what they were writing, a lot of that was held by the reader. So I want to go back to that story, that story way, way, way back in the slideshow presentation. And the one, I don't want to make your head spin, but this one by Grace Paley. My students, when I gave it to them, even though they underlined the words and they could understand every word in the story, they somehow, the meaning fell apart. There was something in between those words which would have made the story meaningful for the students. And I think part of that, and it's a quote by Masuhara, is that for a story to take shape, the student has to be willing to create the world of the story. And that means they have to build it up internally. And working with very short poems like haiku or tanka can give them the skills to build up that world and inhabit it and find the meaning in even longer stories. Because what makes a story isn't the things that are listed on the page, right? That's the plot. A happens and B happens and C happens. And then the story is everything necessary to create the world. So now, when I work with my students, even after we've done the poetry work, I want to give them a chance to read the story and to create those moments and to talk about those moments. And those are what the questions are doing with the tankas. When the students read the tanka, I'm sorry, I'm going back and forth, but when they read a tanka and they think about things like how many people are in the Tonka scene and where are they, or they draw a picture of it, or they have a discussion about whether it's important to act like a girl or act like a boy and why. They're adding all those pieces. They're making all those parts of the Tanka real for them, giving it a verbal life and a communicative power by discussing it. So when they do something like read a longer story now, I've realized that they can take that story and they can put all of the events on a timeline. Oh, I didn't think there was going to be. I hope everyone can see the animation. But these things on the timeline are, oh, everything was going so well. Sorry. These things on the timeline, some of them are the events in the story, but some of them are the things the student has to realize on their own. Like the fact that Vincent, the main character, wants to be a doctor early on in his life. Um, and that these pieces of the story that are inside on the page are not everything, and that the students, if you give them the space and the time to add the pieces of the story that they are creating by themselves and to talk about it, then they can understand what's happening. And timelining the story and adding the pieces that give it the personal meaning was the step that the students needed to take to get real meaning out of the story. A man told me the story of his life. You know, I almost had it there at the end. I hope it made sense. I hope it made sense. Anyway, what I'm basically saying is if you give the students a short story and they have a chance to find the difference between plot, which is just the ABC of what happens on the page, and the things that they have to imagine, and they talk about it, they'll be able to feel more comfortable with the story. Anyway, that is the end of my presentation. There's 2 minutes left, and I wrote a very short Tanka for us, but now I realize it's not Wednesday, it's Tuesday, which means I really must get that glass of wine. Thank you very much. Peggy, how do you teach students to accept? Well, I think that if you, no, I don't think, I know that if you use haiku and tanka, and you allow them to add extra lines and they look at how different they are, and they can see that there's internal logic, even though they're different. They both of those
Great
versions
answer,
make
Kevin.
sense. If they both make sense, then they can begin to understand, oh, well, it's different, but
Other questions for Kevin?
textually, there's nothing wrong with
It
it.
looks like he needs that glass
And
of
if
wine,
they
but I heard
get
Stan
just a
wants
little bit of
recommending this for
experience
some
with that,
questions.
it becomes easier for them not to judge other people's interpretations.
Is there wine in that?
Oh, thanks, Chuck.
This looks like coffee.
I have
You can plug your
I have
blog. The
nothing to
other
do.
things matter,
Rose,
which
thank
is
you for
just
being
fabulous.
here. Hmm. I guess I could. No, it is lovely,
Also,
lovely water. I guess I could plug.
they're fabulous stories. And also, Kevin, I wonder if you could plug
And
your
if you're
book of
looking for
poetry,
short
train poems that
stories,
you have up on Amazon
thank
now.
you, Ayat. If you're
I
looking
believe is
for
available for
short
just 99
stories,
cents. Let me find that.
that's what I
And
that's what
it's
I'm
a
gonna
great
do.
little book. It's a wonderful little book.
The I
Let
have
me
a bunch
find
of
it. Kevin
short stories
Stein,
which
Train
are
Poems.
written specifically for language learners.
9 train poems written to and from. Yes, I got it. It's just a really nice little book. In case you have a Kindle account or 99 cents to spend, it's really nice.
Yes, I have a,
Thanks, Peggy.
a book of poetry, but it's longer.
Some great commentary going on today. Great interaction.
I love that site, Bronco. Thanks for sharing that. How to read poems for beginners. There's just all kinds of great
Maria, thank
poetry
you
around. And not to steal any of Kevin's
for your
thunder here
wonderful
today, I'm going
comments.
to be giving
I was
a course, an ITD advanced course in September on poetry, a writing workshop. And as I'm watching this, I'm thinking, I wonder if Kevin would like to come in and join me and work on that with me. Wouldn't that be great? Let's talk about that.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like stealing thunder,
It
guys.
sounds like collaboration.
Yeah, in the best possible way.
No, you don't. You can keep your hair. Okay, everybody, hang on
I
for a
would
time warp.
love to be a
I'm
part
going
of
to I'm
that, but
going
I think
to
I'd
do two
rather
things. I'm
just
going to
be
stop
a
the recording
student.
now.